Well, so I'm sure he's talking about philosophy of mind. Some people talk about AI as being computational philosophy of mind. There's a sense in which that's true in that by allowing one to run experiments, one can try out things and find out whether they work or not. One of the things I did while not working in cognitive architectures was work on ideas about what science is and what computing is and things like that. And that gave me a certain attitude about where philosophy fits in and what science is and all of that. I came to the belief that science is really about increasing our understanding over time. And anything that does that is part of science. And we have to do that across all the areas, everything that's natural, everything that man's created, everything in the universe from the very small to the very large. We have to try to understand all of that. And there are different methods that we use for doing that. Most sciences define themselves by a particular area, a subject matter that they're studying, and then they apply different kinds of methods to study that. Philosophy started up as sort of all of science and more. It was sort of trying to understand everything, so what I call science now, but it, over the history, has limited itself to essentially a weak method of argumentation, at least if you look at kind of English-speaking psychology, philosophy, not continental philosophy. So they have this method of argumentation that they apply to many different areas. But whenever something comes along and provides a stronger method, like an experimental or a theoretical method where you can prove things or something like that, philosophy in some sense loses that area. It hasn't completely lost philosophy of mind, but between psychology and doing experiments on people and AI being able to do experiments on computational systems and the various kinds of theory that are involved there, I think philosophy is losing its hold on this topic. So it's unfortunately beyond just us keeping them honest, because we have the stronger methods, and there are aspects we can't handle yet, and philosophy can always deal with those aspects. But the core problems of mind, I think, are going to belong to psychology and AI, not to philosophy over time. Like it's happened with natural science and things like that. They eventually dropped out of philosophy just because the philosophical methods were too weak to provide the results that we could get with experimental and other kinds of methods. I did just publish this book in November on computing, the fourth grade scientific domain, which came out of these. So the story goes back. Over the 10 years, I did what was called New Directions at the Information Sciences Institute at USC, and that involved trying to understand where computing, computer science, computer engineering were going, the interactions with other fields, get us started in things. And this all came out of reflections on that, to the point where I now believe that there's something called the computing sciences, which is on a par with the physical, the social, and the life sciences. And in some ways it has some things to teach the other fields, in some ways it still has things to learn from the other ones, and it has all these interesting interactions with them. So I had to do some philosophy of science in the process of writing this book and getting the arguments right, but I apologize in the book for being a naive philosopher and an amateur at philosophy of science, but as a working scientist who wanted to understand these things, I had to kind of go there. So I've read some of the material that's relevant, but I don't claim to be an expert on philosophy of science in any shade of the imagination.
Okay, so yeah, wow, that's a book that you've published and is...
It just came out in November, yeah.
Okay, what's it called again?
On Computing, the Fourth Great Scientific Domain.
Yeah, okay. Is that available on Amazon?
Yeah, it's out of MIT Press, and you can get it on Amazon or other places. I get excited by understanding how to implement more aspects of intelligence and get them to work together in a clean fashion. I'm excited by how to see such capabilities arise out of more primitive things, so I understand why they are the way they are and how they work together. To me, that's when I feel like I'm making progress in science. When I can see elegant ways of making them happen, elegant ways of making them work together well. And when I'm not doing that, it turns out I get kind of depressed and then want to do something else. So for me personally, that's what I find exciting. I mean, I've always found exciting the notion of creating intelligence and of understanding intelligence. And I think we've made progress. I think there's a lot more progress we still have to make. But getting a better and better handle on that, I think, it's one of the true great challenges of humanity. Like understanding the origins of life and the nature of the universe and the origins of the universe, understanding intelligence and how it comes about, and all of that has both great, just great scientific interest and great practical import. Well, there's always a tension in humanity between seeking the future and being afraid of it. And there's always ones who want to preserve what is versus create what isn't. And pendulum swings some. I think unless we see a complete destruction of civilization as we know it, I don't think we're going to back off from this. But I would hope even if that happens, that again, far enough in the future, it will continue to the point where it's understood. But I think we'll get there before any major catastrophes happen. There are lots of legitimate things to worry about. I worry about so if computers are going to be able to make intelligent decisions more quickly than we can, whether we will by necessity turn everything over to them, and whether we will understand the implications of that when we do it and be able to deal with them properly. It's legitimate to worry about, in the past when we've built technology that augmented or replaced people, we've generally found other roles for people. I worry about whether we will be able to continue to do that. In the past, again, you can't always predict what that's going to be. So the hope is that there will still be something there, even if we don't know what it is at this point. But you can't guarantee that it will be there. You can, from the past, be an optimist that we will find something. But it would be bad as a species if we felt we were relevant. Now, you can take the long view and say, well, that's life. These are, in some sense, our descendants, and people have talked in those terms. And we should feel proud of that and be willing to step aside, though unlikely we will be willing to. Or we may find ways of combining it with us in some way, that the future isn't one or the other, but some combination. And we don't know what's going to happen with any of that. Again, we see all kinds of blends increasing all the time. Everything from just glasses, which are a form of human augmentation with technology, to all the different kinds of implants and other kinds of things we're doing. As that happens more and more neurally, we don't know what's going to happen. So it's exciting, but it's also scary. Mm-hmm. And those are both legitimate reactions. I tend to believe that you always have to that it's better to understand than to stay in ignorance. But knowledge can be dangerous. I would guess ever since we've been humans, even before we were humans. Using a stick to scratch at the ground is using technology. Using a wheel to essentially augment our mobility is technology. Even using animals to augment our ability to carry things is a form of technology. Taming animals is technology. Developing strains of crops is technology. So I think as long as we've been humans and before, we've been augmenting our abilities with technology of one sort or another. As we understand the world better, we are able to develop more powerful technologies, which has both positives and negatives as we do it. But it's part of ourselves as a species that we invent ways of augmenting our abilities and augmenting what's out there in the natural world that we found, to the point where it's not even clear what's natural and what's artificial at times.
Would you classify language as a technology?
Absolutely. It's a technology we developed for communication to improve on what we could do before we had before it. I read a lot of science fiction when I was young. I haven't read a lot in many years. So my understanding of science fiction authors is rather out of date. When I was young, I read Clarke and Asimov and Heinlein, so that probably dates me. When I got a little older, I liked Hogan, James Hogan, I think it was, I forget. And I really haven't read a lot in the last probably 30 years. Somehow with my whole research life focused on the future and on technology, when I relax now, I don't read about the future, I read about the past. I read history and I read 18th and 19th century English literature, trying to understand old societies and how they led to what we are now. So somehow I got off science fiction. Partly, if I understand right, so the Renaissance is partly due to the rediscovery of ancient Greek and Roman writings, and getting a better understanding of the world from that than we had through the other ages, at least in kind of the European world. It was a belief that we could understand what was happening in the world, and that it wasn't just inscrutable God that we couldn't and shouldn't try to understand. And that optimism that we could understand is sort of what led to it. But that's completely a naive statement, so I don't know whether that's true or not. But that's kind of my sense of it. A big thing in that literature were the distinction between the classes, how those distinctions were maintained, and how they evolved over the years to some extent. One notion I've had is that again, I don't have this kind of clearly articulated. So the first kind of human aspect that we automated in one fashion was physical power. And we did that by animals and simple kinds of machines. Before we did that, again, so this is naive, I don't know if it's anthropology or what you'd call it, but this is sort of what I've come up with through reading and thinking about various kinds of things. Before we did that, the people who led were the strongest, the biggest and strongest, because they could dominate. But when you can automate that sort of thing, that became less important, and it became cheapened. So initially the ruling class were sort of the strongest, you'd say, the most powerful physically. Once that became commoditized, then the ruling class had to separate itself from others in another way. Sometimes it does it in very superficial ways. So if most people are working outdoors and become suntanned, then you have to stay indoors and become very white, very pale, to show that you're not part of that. You have to find ways of dressing that the others can't afford so that you can distinguish yourself. So they're kind of artificial ways of distinguishing it. But I think, so the next thing, there's kind of intellectual distinction, which led to certain kinds of leadership. And we're trying to automate that now. So I'm not being very coherent about this, but it becomes kind of cheapened as we automate it to some extent. What we saw in the English aristocracy in some of the early 19th century, for example, was you could hire people who would be smart for you. If you were a landowner, you hired a steward to run your estate and so on. They looked down on intelligence. They looked down on striving for success. That was the mercantile class or the clerks and stuff. And they elevated emotion and what they called sensibility to be the peak of human kind of expression. And if you didn't have that sensibility, you weren't gentle in the terms of like gentlemen or something. So the upper class was always trying to find sort of basic assumptions they have about people and what people are like and what women versus men are like. And they're just unquestioned, and they're part of the basic fabrics of society, and they lead to many of the rules for how society works. And we just disagree so completely with them about so many of those things. But they just accepted all of that unquestionably. And then to get into that mindset and to understand how they thought and how they made decisions based on that. and why they did things that to us look so strange based on their different worldview about people and how people fit into the world. That's part of what's interesting as well. In that ways, it's a little like science fiction. It's thinking of a different society and a different culture and a different world. It just happens to be in the past rather than hypothetical in the future. Well, there's always a tension between them. I mean, you look at any era and you're going to see a tension, and sometimes one force winning out more than the other, and different segments of society pushing one versus the other. So the leaders of business were generally for progress. The aristocracy often wasn't, because the merchants getting rich threatened their status, whereas the workers would be threatened because the manufacturers wanted to bring in machines and automate things, so they're afraid their jobs would go away. So you saw different segments of society afraid or eager for it, depending on kind of their interests. And that kind of thing always happens. But ultimately, to the extent that, quote, progress, or whatever you want to call it, tends to make things better for most people, it's almost inevitable unless there's some other kind of dramatic force that changes things. It's just too strong a pull as long as it's doing that. And even though we can look back and look at things that were better a while ago, for the vast majority of people, right now is so much better than it was 100 or 200 years ago that there's just no comparison. And that I think is what keeps pulling us forward, even with the fear and the disruption that happens with all of this. Well, so, I mean, that harks back to the Luddites, 19th century, I think mainly England, where they did smash machines because they threatened their jobs. I don't know. Certainly jobs will be threatened. I mean, certainly certain classes of jobs will be threatened. Whether new kinds of jobs open up, we don't know, but those who are put out of their jobs are going to be in trouble. A lot depends on how society, again, copes with that. In 19th century England, there was very little kind of social network to help these people who were put out of jobs. If we have a slightly more enlightened government, it may not be quite as stressful. If it's massive quantities of people, though, and almost everyone, then there's just no way we can deal with it. If it's a smaller portion, then hopefully we do deal with it in some humane fashion. I mean, most of the nightmare scenarios about AI technology is when the systems were on their own. They're not just sort of intelligent slaves, which is like what happened when the rich people had poor people to do their thinking for them. I mean, for a while it will be that. At what point it goes beyond that and gets threatening to more than just jobs isn't completely clear. I mean, I think they have to have more autonomy. We have to have less control over them. There are lots of things we can do to maintain that control. So it's not at all clear how any of that's going to play out. Well, I guess some stuff is looking at human augmentation and combinations of humans and machines and beyond humans. Some of it is worried about the existential threat to humanity of these things. I haven't tended to get involved in those kinds of things. I think, at least for the near term, the issues in the ethical and moral issues with respect to AI, I think are actually not terribly different from those in the rest of computer science. I don't think the issues are that unique in the near future. In the longer term, I think they are. But I guess it's my personality. I don't like horror movies. I don't like to think about bad things happening. So it's my own personality that I just don't want to think about it. Which isn't to say other people shouldn't think about it and think hard about it. But it's not a big part of what I do. I guess because of that personality, I just ever since I was a kid, I'm just not interested in nightmare scenarios. dystopias, all of that, no, just leaves me cold. Again, I tend to believe it's better to understand than not to understand. And so I believe it's better to build and manage than to not do. That's just my approach to life. Well, I don't know how to reduce it. I mean, there are great possibilities for technology to continue. I mean, technology can be a great user of energy. It can also be a tool in reducing energy use. And so my thoughts of it are mostly on those latter ways of how technology can be used to reduce energy use and therefore the drivers of climate change. But I think we're beyond a point of no return at this point. Though we could still make it even much worse than we know we're going to. So climate change, I believe, is going to happen. At this point, it's just a question of how bad it's going to be. Technology will also help us, I guess, cope with the results of it, hopefully. I don't think we'll be able to hold back the seas as they rise, but it will certainly help make places livable that wouldn't be livable otherwise because of climate change. So it'll be a part of our toolkit for surviving in the changing environment.
Okay.
Just like wool, I mean, fur clothing was was necessary during the Ice Age. Technology helps you survive in bad climates. So I believe it's inevitable, in the sense that either we have to continue evolving and we will have the ability to control our evolution in the future, and whether that's done through kind of the life sciences, the computing sciences, or the physical sciences, or some combination of them. I think the pressure will be there to do that. And again, if some people decide not to, others will decide to. And they're going to win out in the long run unless something really goes wrong. So I believe it's inevitable unless somehow we can all technology. I mean, we're transhuman right now, I mean, compared to the way we were as individuals hundreds or thousands of years ago. And I think it's just accelerating. And mostly I find it exciting. I mean, again, there's always reason to be concerned and to have legitimate fears, but making people more capable, adding the ability to, I mean, we're going to be able to have people who can really be telepathic, for all the good and bad that can come out of that. Those are exciting possibilities. Well, a lot of scientific work you don't necessarily agree or disagree with. You ask how much. I mean, for me, when I look at a scientific talk, I ask how much did I learn from it, and that's always what I care about. If I didn't learn anything from it, it's useless to me. And if I learn only a little bit, even if I believe that a lot, it's still kind of useless to me. So I'm always looking for someone who's going to tell me something I don't know or get my mind to go down some different path. The two that I guess have done that to me the most so far, and for very different reasons, were a couple of talks Ben Gersel gave yesterday. I find it very interesting what he's doing in OpenCog. He's taking a very different approach to what I'm doing, working with more specialized modules, but he's pushing them very far. And he didn't talk as much about the interaction among them. He's got to get to that. But when I look at what he's doing with those, I constantly ask, could I do that in my system? And if not, why not? And am I missing some major source of action? Again, I want to do what he's doing in a more uniform style. But when I see someone doing what I think is interesting and shows potential, I want to see what's the implication for what I'm trying to do. And of the stuff I've seen, his talks were that got that kind of thinking going the most. And the other one was Tom Dietrich's. Again, thinking out the capabilities there and thinking of some of the things he was talking about, the issues with learning there. Again, that had a lot to communicate to me in the issues I'm concerned about in Sigma. So I in some sense, learned the most from those, and they got me thinking the most, and that's really what I care about when seeing talks. conference is good to talk to people and get stimulated, and to hear something that gets you thinking in a new way. Otherwise, it's not really worth the travel.